The moment the stagecoach wheel shattered on the lip of the ravine, and Eliza Blackwell felt the world tilt sideways, she understood with perfect, terrible clarity that she was entirely alone in the most absolute sense. 3 miles from the nearest town, 3 miles from any soul who might hear her scream, and about to meet the red Arizona dust in a way that no amount of Boston finishing school had prepared her for. The summer of 1882 had already been unkind to Eliza. She had buried her father in June, watched her mother remarry a man with cold eyes and colder hands in July, and spent August packing a single trunk with the essentials of a new life she had not chosen, but had accepted with the stubborn, quiet dignity that was perhaps her greatest inheritance from the father she missed so terribly. The plan had been simple enough: travel from Tucson to the small town of Redemption, Arizona, where a position as schoolteacher had been arranged through correspondence with the local preacher, a Reverend Alcott who wrote letters full of scripture and enthusiasm in equal measure. It was not the life she had imagined as a girl reading novels by lamplight, but it was a life, and it was hers, and she had clutched that certainty like a woman clutches a railing in a storm. The stagecoach had left Tucson at dawn with 4 other passengers. A salesman named Mr. Hobbs who smelled of pomade and talked without ceasing about patent medicine, a quiet Mexican woman named Rosa who held a rosary and watched the desert with knowing eyes, and an older couple, the Hendersons, who had been making the Tucson to Redemption run twice a year for a decade, and saw nothing remarkable about any of it. The driver was a leathery man named Cooley, who communicated exclusively through grunts and the occasional sharp whistle to his horses. His partner up top, the shotgun rider, was a young fellow named Pete who could not have been more than 17, and who had spent the first hour of the journey trying to catch Eliza's eye through the small window above the coach door. Everything had been entirely ordinary for the first 40 miles. Then Cooley had taken what Rosa quietly called the wrong cut, a shortcut through the canyon lands that supposedly shaved 20 minutes off the journey, but which required navigating a narrow shelf road above a dry creek bed. The horses had been nervous before the wheel gave way. Eliza had noticed that, had noticed the way the lead horse kept tossing his head and fighting the bit, the way the canyon walls seemed to press and close and hold the afternoon heat like a furnace. She had been about to say something to Mrs. Henderson, something about the horses, something that instinct was pushing up through her chest like water finding a crack in stone, when the right rear wheel caught the crumbling edge of the road and the whole right side of the coach simply dropped away. It happened fast and slow at the same time, the way disasters always do. The coach lurched, tilted, and Eliza's door flew open. The strap she had been holding broke. The world spun, red rock and blue sky trading places, and then she was in the air, and then she was not in the air anymore, and the dry creek came up and took her with a force that drove every thought and every breath out of her body at once. She lay still for a long moment. Above her, she could hear the screaming of horses and the crash of the coach still completing its tumble, metal and wood, finding the bottom of the ravine in pieces. And she thought with strange detachment that the pomade salesman was probably not going to make his sales calls this week. Then she breathed, and the breath hurt, and she decided that hurting meant she was alive, and being alive meant she needed to assess her situation with some degree of practicality. She had been thrown clear of the coach. That was lucky. The coach itself had gone down the ravine and she had landed on the shelf road, which was also lucky. Her left arm hurt considerably, and she had a deep cut along her cheekbone that was bleeding with the cheerful enthusiasm of cuts on the face. But when she tried her limbs, one at a time, in the careful, systematic way her father had taught her, he had been a physician, Dr. Amos Blackwell, and he had believed in systematic approaches to everything. Nothing appeared to be broken. Her trunk was gone, somewhere down in the ravine with the coach. Her hat was gone. Her hairpins were scattered across 15 feet of red Arizona rock. And the sun, she noted as she sat up and looked at its position in the sky, was already beginning its afternoon descent. She stood, looked in both directions along the shelf road, looked down into the ravine where the coach had settled in pieces among the rocks and scrub brush, and where she could see no movement, no sign of life, though she called out 3 times and listened with her whole body for an answer. Nothing came back but the faint hot wind moving through the canyon. Her heart clenched with grief for them, for Rosa with her rosary, for the Hendersons who had made this trip a dozen times without incident, for even Mr. Hobbs and his patent medicine. But she could not get down to them, not on that vertical rock face, and she was beginning to understand that she had perhaps 10 minutes of standing here in anguish before she had to start making practical decisions about her own survival. 3 miles from redemption. She had heard Cooley say it before he had taken the shortcut. 3 miles, which in a coach on a good road was nothing at all, and on foot in the Arizona heat in the shoes she was wearing, good leather boots, sensible for a schoolteacher, not made for desert scrambling, was rather a more serious proposition. She had no water. She had no food. She had the dress on her back, the boots on her feet, and a small coin purse in her pocket that contained exactly $4.30, which was not going to help her much out here. She began walking toward redemption. She had covered perhaps half a mile, picking her way along the shelf road as it gradually descended from the canyon into open scrubland, when the ground came up and surprised her. It was not a dramatic fall. She did not tumble or roll. She simply stepped on a loose stone, turned her ankle with a clean, sharp, nauseating wrench, and sat down in the dust with all the undignified abruptness of a dropped sack of flour. She sat there for a moment, breathing carefully through the pain, looking at the pale blue sky overhead, and thinking that this was quite enough of this particular day. Thank you very much. That was when she heard the horse. It was not coming fast, which was the first thing she noticed. It was coming at an easy walk, coming from the direction of redemption, which meant someone was coming toward her rather than away from her, and the steady, unhurried rhythm of it, one horse, shod, picking its way across the rocky ground, told her it was being ridden by someone who knew how to sit a horse in rough country. She could not see it yet. The scrubland here was dotted with mesquite and ocotillo, and the road turned around a low red outcropping about 300 yards ahead. She waited. The horse came around the outcropping first. A bay, dark and solid, with the kind of deep chest that spoke of endurance rather than speed. And then the rider came into view, and he was looking straight at her, because of course he was. A woman sitting in the middle of the road bleeding from her face was not something you missed, even at 300 yards. He was somewhere around 30, she estimated, though the sun and the wind of this country had a way of making it difficult to be precise. He was lean in the particular way of men who worked physically but ate irregularly, and he was tall in the saddle, not because he was performing height, but because he simply was that way, straight-backed without stiffness, easy without sloppiness. He wore a plain work shirt, sun-faded to somewhere between blue and gray, and a hat that had been through serious weather and knew it. He had a rifle in the saddle scabbard and a revolver on his hip, both of which were entirely unremarkable for a man riding this country in 1882, and he wore neither like he was thinking about them, which was somehow the most reassuring thing about him. He rode up to her and stopped the bay about 10 feet away and looked down at her with an expression that was not alarm, not pity, and not the uncomfortable male awkwardness of a man who doesn't know what to do with a distressed woman. It was something more like careful assessment, the look of a man who had encountered unexpected problems before and was already working through solutions. "Stagecoach," he said. "Yes," she said. "Canyon Road." "Yes." He swung down from the bay in one movement, landed quietly, and was kneeling in front of her in the dust with a canteen in his hand before she had finished deciding whether or not to feel embarrassed about sitting in the road. He held the canteen out, and she took it and drank, and it was warm and tasted faintly of the canteen itself, and was absolutely the finest thing she had ever put in her mouth in her 24 years of life. "Anyone else?" he asked. She told him about the others, told him about the ravine, told him the location as precisely as she could. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment, looking back the way he had come with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "There's a ranch hand I passed about a mile back, heading the same direction I was coming from," he said. "I'll send him back to get help from town. He's got a faster horse than I do anyway." He looked at her ankle, which was swelling visibly even through the boot leather. "Can you ride?" "I believe so," she said. "Your cheek needs seeing too," he said, "and your ankle." "I've got a camp about a mile further up the road where I was making for, got medicine and bandages there." He paused. "My name is Clyde Barnett. I run a small outfit 3 miles east of Redemption. I've been riding fence today." "Eliza Blackwell," she said. "I was going to be the new schoolteacher in Redemption." Something shifted in his expression at that, something that was not quite amusement and not quite interest but was somewhere in the warm territory between the two. "Was," he said. "A.M.," she corrected herself, because she was not the kind of woman who gave in to self-pity. "I am going to be the new schoolteacher in Redemption." He looked at her for a moment with those steady eyes. They were dark brown, she noticed, the color of good soil after rain, and then he said, "All right, Miss Blackwell. Let's get you there." He helped her to her feet with an arm that was careful rather than forceful, with the courtesy of someone who had thought about the difference, and he held the bay steady while she mounted, which took longer than it should have because of the ankle, and also because she had not ridden in 2 years, and riding side saddle on a working cowboy's saddle was a logistical challenge that no amount of feminine dignity could entirely smooth over. He saw her settled, then swung up behind her without making a production of it, reached around her for the reins, and clicked the bay forward. His chest was a solid, warm thing at her back, and his arm that held the reins was close enough to her side that she was aware of it with every breath, and she sat very straight and looked at the road ahead and told herself with great firmness that this was an emergency situation, and she was being practical. He told her his plan as they rode. He would signal the ranch hand, whose name was Victor and who was a good man with a steady head, and Victor would ride to Redemption for the search party while Clyde took Eliza to his camp to see to her injuries. The camp was a line camp he used when he was working the far fence line, just a canvas lean-to and a fire ring and a supply cache, but he had everything necessary. He raised 2 fingers to his lips and produced a whistle that cut clean through the desert air, and within a minute Victor appeared from behind a ridge, a compact, dark-complexioned man on a roan, who listened to the situation without any waste of expression, and said only, "I'll ride hard," before turning the roan and giving it its head. Clyde watched him go and nodded, and they moved on toward the camp. "Are you in pain?" he asked after a while. "Yes," she said, because she was not the sort of woman who lied about practical things, "but it's manageable. The ankle twisted or turned over, the outside, not the inside. My father was a doctor, I know the difference." "Was," he said, careful in the way he had been careful about the other word. "He died in June," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry." The simplicity of it was somehow better than elaboration would have been. She appreciated it and said so, not with words, but by letting her shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, the way they do when someone has said the right thing. The camp was exactly as described, a canvas lean, to stretch between 2 ironwood trees above a sandy wash, a fire ring of stones, a weathered wooden chest half buried in the sand where the supplies were kept. It was orderly in the way of a man who lived alone but had not given up on himself, everything in its place without excess. He helped her down and got her settled on a flat rock that served as a seat near the fire ring, and then he opened the chest and produced bandages and a small brown bottle of carbolic solution, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had doctored his own injuries in the field enough times to know where everything was without looking. "This is going to sting," he said about the carbolic. "My father said the same thing about half his patients before he said, and I quote, 'I am going to need you to hold very still,'" she said. That got him. Not a big laugh, not the performative kind. Just a genuine one, brief and real, and it changed his face entirely when it came younger somehow and warmer, the wary watchfulness dropping away for just a moment. "I'll try not to require the second part," he said. He cleaned the cut on her cheek with a steadiness of hand that she noted with professional appreciation, being her father's daughter. He taped it with a small strip of plaster from the supply cache. Then he crouched in front of her ankle, and she was very careful not to wince when he removed the boot, and he was very careful to be as quick about it as possible. He wrapped the ankle with a competence that confirmed his claim to having dealt with this before. "How long have you been ranching?" she asked, while he worked. 8 years out here," he said. "Came from Texas when I was 22. Worked cattle drives for 3 years before I had enough put by to start my own place." "It's small," he added, with a self-awareness that was different from self-deprecation. 40 head and 6 horses, and about 200 acres of the least forgiving land in Arizona, but it's mine." "That's not nothing," she said. He glanced up at her. "No," he said. "It's not." He had water in a barrel at the camp, properly covered against dust, and he boiled some on the fire he built with the efficient speed of a man who did not need to think about it, and made coffee in a tin pot that had clearly seen years of use, and the coffee was strong and bitter, and she drank it gratefully while the sun began to move toward the canyon walls in the west. They talked the way people talk when they are waiting, not the filling silence talk of discomfort, but the exploring talk of two people who have found, unexpectedly, that the other person is interesting. She told him about Boston, about her father's practice, about the reading she had done, the music. She played piano tolerably well, she said, though there had not been one available to her for the last 2 years. He listened to all of this with the quality of attention that is rarer than people think, the kind that means a person is actually taking in what you say rather than waiting for their turn to speak. And he spoke in return, not in the easy outpoured way of lonely men who have been too long without company, but with the measured candor of someone who had decided she could be trusted with the honest version of things. He told her he had been born in a small Texas town that no longer existed on any map, his father having been a cattleman of modest means and considerable stubbornness, his mother having been the kind of woman who read books by firelight after everyone else was asleep and who had, without fanfare, ensured that her son could do the same. She had died of fever when he was 15, and he had not spoken much about her since, he said, without particular drama, as a simple statement of fact. He told her that he had come to Arizona because Texas had been filling up in ways that felt like walls to him, that he had needed the particular quality of space this desert offered, the space that was not comfortable or forgiving but that was honest, that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. "I think I understand that," Eliza said, "though I wouldn't have before today." "Before today," he said. "Before today I was a person who lived in other people's plans," she said. "My father's plans, my mother's plans, the plan of the woman who was supposed to marry the right man in Boston and have a settled, correct life. Today I lost my trunk and twisted my ankle and got thrown from a stagecoach." She paused, "and I find I am still here." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Yes," he said, "you are." It was simple, and it was said with something in it that she would think about later, something that was not a compliment precisely, but was something that landed differently than a compliment would have, more substantial somehow, more real. Victor returned before sundown with 2 men from the search party, who reported that the others from the coach had been found. Mrs. Henderson had a broken wrist and considerable bruising. Rosa had a laceration on her forehead but was otherwise unhurt. Mr. Henderson had been unconscious but had roused by the time the search party reached them. Mr. Hobbs, the salesman, had fared the worst with 2 broken ribs, but the town doctor had gone out, and the prognosis was recovery for all. The driver Cooley had a broken leg. Young Pete, the shotgun rider, had been thrown clear on the other side and found his own way to redemption in an impressive display of 17-year-old determination. Eliza received all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes closed, and the particular held quality of her breath told Clyde, who was watching her carefully, that she had been afraid the news would be worse. When she opened her eyes, they were bright, and she pressed her lips together for a moment, and then she said simply, "Good. That is very good." One of the men from the search party, a broad-shouldered fellow named Jim Reardon, who introduced himself as the town blacksmith, had brought a spare horse for Eliza and cheerfully offered to escort her to Redemption. He was a friendly man, openly curious about her in the way of small towns where a new face was still an event, and he launched immediately into a detailed briefing on the town: who lived where, who was important, where the school was, who the preacher was, the current state of the town's three main points of contention, which appeared to involve a disputed water right, the question of whether the saloon ought to be moved 2 streets east, and a long-running argument between 2 neighboring ranchers about a fence line. Clyde saddled the bay and spoke briefly with Victor, who was heading back to the ranch to see to the evening feeding, and then he fell in alongside Eliza as the small party made for Redemption on the last light of the day. Jim Reardon did not appear to notice or mind that Clyde had inserted himself into the escort, being fully absorbed in his town briefing, and Eliza kept pace with Clyde's bay with a careful steadiness that told him the ankle was hurting more than she was letting on, but that she was not going to say so, because she had already spent enough of this day being a burden, and she had opinions about how much of that she was willing to be. "You don't have to ride all the way in," she said, when Jim had paused his briefing to point out a water tower on the horizon. "I know," Clyde said. She looked at him. He looked at the horizon. They rode on. Redemption was a proper western town of the era, a main street with a width that had been designed for cattle drives to pass through, lined with wooden buildings of varying ages and ambitions. There was a general store, a bank, the saloon Jim had mentioned, a hotel called the Frontier House, a livery, a barber, a small church at the far end whose white paint was fresh and optimistic. There were boardwalks on both sides of the main street, and a few electric arc lights had been installed along the center of it the previous year, a source of considerable civic pride that Jim mentioned twice. The town was awake and active despite the evening hour, because news of the stagecoach accident had traveled ahead of them, and there was a gathering quality to the people on the boardwalk, the way towns gather when something has happened. Reverend Alcott was among the first to meet them, a tall, thin man of about 50, with the face of someone who believed with great sincerity in the redemptive capacity of hot meals and practical assistance, and who had, very sensibly, arranged both in anticipation of Eliza's arrival. He welcomed her with a warmth that was entirely genuine and not at all fulsome, helped her down from the horse with the assist of Jim Reardon, took in the bandaged cheek and the careful way she was standing, and said, "You'll stay at the Alcott house tonight, Miss Blackwell, and hear no argument about it from me. Martha is already making up the room." Eliza turned to Clyde, who had dismounted and was standing at the bay's head with the reins loose in his hand, watching her get settled into Redemption the way a man watches something he's carried safely to its destination, satisfied and already preparing to leave. "Thank you," she said. It was inadequate and she knew it. The kind of thanks you give a man who has bandaged your face and made you coffee, and listened to you talk about your dead father in the flat, honest way that made you feel that grief was not a thing to be ashamed of, and then ridden 3 miles alongside you in the evening, just to make sure you got to where you were going. She looked at him and tried to put more of it in the look. He took his hat off briefly and nodded. "Glad you're all right, Miss Blackwell." And he remounted the bay and rode out into the dark with the easy, unhurried rhythm of a man who had somewhere to be and was accustomed to finding his way there alone. Reverend Alcott's house was warm and clean, and his wife Martha was a woman of such concentrated practical kindness that Eliza felt she had been found by competence rather than arrived at it. There was hot water for washing, a proper supper of beans and cornbread and salt pork, and a bed with a real feather mattress that she fell into like she was falling through clouds. She lay there in the dark of the quiet room and listened to the small sounds of the house settling around her, and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere across town. And she thought about the dark-eyed man on the bay horse who had come around the red rock outcropping at exactly the right moment and who had, without making a fuss about it, been entirely sufficient to every need she had had in the last several hours. She thought about him considerably more than was probably necessary, given that he was a stranger, and she had known him for approximately 4 hours, and she had more pressing matters to attend to. And she fell asleep thinking about it, and dreamed of open desert, and the sound of a horse moving at an easy walk across red stone. In the days that followed, Eliza Blackwell established herself in redemption with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for a life she could call her own. The school was a one-room building set back from the main street, painted the same optimistic white as the church, with 8 long desks inside and a blackboard that had been recently replaced and still smelled faintly of paint. The previous teacher, a Mr. Garvey, had left in March under circumstances that nobody explained very precisely, but that Eliza gathered had involved a disagreement with the saloon and a horse that wasn't his. She did not ask for more details. She opened all the windows, reorganized the books on the shelf in the corner, tested the blackboard, and wrote her name on it in large, clear letters. Miss E. Blackwell. She had 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, of varying preparation and attention, and she loved them almost immediately with the unsentimental, clear-eyed love of someone who sees children as actual people, rather than small versions of the adults they will become. There was a Navajo boy named Thomas, whose mother had sent him with considerable misgivings, who sat in the back and watched everything with eyes that missed nothing and who, Eliza discovered within the first week, was already reading at a level that none of the other students had reached. She gave him harder books without comment and moved his desk so he could see the board better, and she did not make a performance of it in either direction. No special praise, no special treatment, just the acknowledgement that a mind was a mind and deserved what it needed. His mother came to see her after the second week, a quiet, watchful woman named Naya who stood in the doorway of the school at the end of the day and looked at Eliza with the evaluation of someone who has been disappointed before and was taking careful note. "He says you gave him a different book," Naya said. "Yes," Eliza said. "He had read everything else on the shelf. I brought one of my own." Naya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband says the people in this town do not usually think well of us." "Some of them probably don't," Eliza said, because she had been in redemption long enough to know the truth of that. "I cannot speak for them. I can tell you that Thomas is the sharpest student I have, and I intend to teach him accordingly." Something shifted in Naya's face. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the consideration of warmth. She nodded once and left. And the next morning Thomas arrived with a lunch pail that was full enough to suggest his mother had opinions about adequate feeding. She was at the school 6 days a week, teaching in the mornings and using the afternoons for planning and the occasional home visits that parents seemed to expect, and that she found she did not mind at all. She had taken a room at the Frontier House, which was not ideal but was private, and she had arranged for her meals at the hotel dining room and made herself a consistent presence at the Sunday services, which Reverend Alcott delivered with the quality of a man who had thought hard about what he believed and was willing to be honest about the parts that were still in question. She did not see Clyde Barnett for 11 days. She noticed the not seeing. She tried not to notice the not seeing, and succeeded only moderately, which told her something about herself that she put aside to examine later. The town was small enough that people mentioned him. Someone always mentioned the Barnett Ranch in passing, usually in connection with water rights or fence lines or the quality of his stock. And each time she attended to it with a careful, controlled interest that she recognized in herself with some irritation, as the same thing she had once felt reading the last chapters of a novel she did not want to end. He came to Redemption on the 12th day for supplies, and she was at the general store with a list that included chalk and ink and 3 new primers she had ordered from Tucson, and she heard his voice before she saw him. He was speaking with the store owner, Tom Briggs, about a bill of sale for wire fencing, and his voice in the store had the same quality it had had in the desert, the straightforward, unhurried quality of a man who thought about what he was going to say before he said it. She turned from the shelf of primers and he was at the counter, and he saw her at the same moment she saw him, and there was a brief, real moment where both of them were simply there, looking at each other, and neither of them said anything for just long enough to make it clear that neither of them was unaffected. "Miss Blackwell," he said. "Mr. Barnett," she said. "How are you?" "Well enough," he said. "How's the ankle?" "Entirely recovered," she said. "Thank you for asking." Tom Briggs watched this exchange with the barely concealed interest of a man whose general store served as the primary intelligence-gathering operation of a small town, and Eliza was aware of it, and she thought Clyde probably was too, but he did not adjust his bearing for the audience. "You settling in all right?" he asked. "Very much so," she said. "I have 23 students, and one of them is going to be remarkable if we can manage to keep him in school long enough. How is the ranch?" The question surprised him slightly. She could see it. The small adjustment of a man who has not expected to be asked a genuine question. Told her briefly but with the specificity of real information. The summer pasture was holding up better than last year. He was thinking of adding a second water tank before fall. One of his horses had thrown a shoe in a bad spot and was recovering. "Victor is good," he added. "He told me to make sure you were all right. He felt badly about the accident." "He shouldn't," she said. "He rode fast and rode well, and the people in that ravine are alive because of it. Please tell him that from me." "I will," he said. He finished his business with Tom Briggs, which took another few minutes, and she finished her own, and they ended up on the boardwalk at the same moment, both holding packages, and the afternoon was full of the pale gold light that the desert produced in the early weeks of September, the light that made everything look like it had been painted rather than found. "I wonder," he said, with the measured quality of a man choosing words carefully, "whether you might want to see the school. I mean, whether I might see it. I've been thinking about the children of the ranchers east of town, and whether there might be a way to arrange better attendance during roundup season." She looked at him. He looked at the light. "I would be happy to show you the school," she said. "It's just up the street." They walked up the street in the afternoon gold, and she showed him the school, the desks, the blackboard with her name still on it, the books on the shelf, the map of the United States pinned to the wall that still showed territories rather than states in the Southwest. He stood in the middle of it with his hat in his hand, and looked around with a seriousness that was not performance. That was the genuine consideration of a man thinking about children and what they needed. And he asked good questions about the attendance problem and listened well to her answers. She told him about Thomas, and something in his face changed the way it had changed when she had corrected, was to am on the road warmly like a door opening. "His mother is Naya," he said. "Her husband sells horses. He sold me my best working horse 2 years ago. He's a good horseman." "She's a careful woman," Eliza said. "She came to see me about Thomas. She has reason to be careful." "Yes," he said, with the plainness of a man who did not pretend the injustices of his time were not happening. "She does." He looked at the map on the wall. "I wonder if you'd had enough of the school for the day and would consider taking a walk." "Where?" she said. "There's a place about 10 minutes east of town on the creek road where there's a cottonwood grove," he said. "It's pleasant in the evening. I used to go there when I was first in this country, and trying to decide whether I was going to stay." She considered him, this steady, direct man with the careful eyes who had found her sitting in the road 3 miles from anywhere and treated the finding of her as simply the next thing that needed to be done well, and she said, "I would like that." They walked to the cottonwood grove as the light thickened toward evening, and the cottonwoods were everything he had said, tall and silver-leafed, and murmuring in the small breeze off the creek. The shade under them, a different quality of cool from the flat desert shade. something more alive in it. They walked without hurrying, and their conversation moved from the practical to the less so, with the ease of two people who have already talked about real things and found the other person to be honest. He told her about the drives he had done before settling here, the long hauls north from Texas, the months in the saddle, the way the land had opened up the further you got from the settled parts, the way that kind of solitude either opened you up or closed you down, and you didn't always know which it was doing until you came back to towns and found out what was left. He told her about a winter he had spent snowbound at a line camp in New Mexico with a broken arm and a good dog, and 3 months of supplies and 50 miles between him and any other person, and how he had come out of it knowing what kind of man he was. "What kind of man is that?" she asked. "The kind that does better with purpose than without it," he said. "I needed the ranch. I needed to be working towards something. The space was never the problem. I could always find enough space. It was the purpose. My father used to say that medicine gave him the architecture of his days," she said. "Without it, he would not have known how to build himself." "Yes," he said, "that's it exactly." They reached the creek, which ran low and clear over pale stones, and they sat on the bank in the last of the light while the creek made its small, constant sounds. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, a bird was working out a complicated opinion about the evening. She was aware, sitting here with this man in this place, of a settling, not the settling of resignation, but the settling of a foundation, the sense of ground becoming solid under what she was building. She was also aware that she was sitting closer to him than was entirely necessary for two people sharing a creek bank, and that he had not moved away, and that neither of these facts was an accident. "I don't know very much about you," she said, with the directness that had always been more her style than coyness. "What would you like to know?" he said. "Everything," she said, and then heard herself say it and felt the heat in her face that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun, and she looked at the creek. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the same steady quality he brought to everything, "That seems fair. It'll take more than one evening, though." She looked at him. There was the barest edge of something in his eyes, something that was not quite a smile but was in the same family, and her heart was doing something she had not authorized. "Well," she said, with a composure she was rather proud of, "I have been in redemption for 11 days and I appear to intend to stay. I expect there will be other evenings." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, direct eyes, and then he said very quietly, "I expect there will." They walked back to town as the first stars appeared, and he left her at the frontier house with a courtesy that was entirely proper and entirely insufficient to the feeling of the evening, and she went up to her room and stood at the window and looked at the night sky for a considerable time before she remembered that she had papers to mark. Over the next 6 weeks, the other evenings materialized. There was no formal understanding reached, no explicit agreement, but there was a pattern that established itself with the naturalness of water finding its course. He came to town on Saturdays for supplies, and on Saturday afternoons they walked. Sometimes to the Cottonwood Grove, sometimes east along the Canyon Road, sometimes just through the quiet streets of Redemption in the fading afternoon. They talked with the sustained, building quality of two people who were genuinely exploring each other, finding the shapes of each other's minds and hearts and histories. She told him about the books she loved, the one she had read by the window in Boston while the snow came down and made the world outside look temporary. She told him about the injustice of her mother's remarriage, the cold-eyed stepfather, and the way the family house had stopped feeling like a place she belonged, and how the job in Redemption had been advertised in the back of a church circular that she had read at the lowest point of the worst week, and how she had applied for it with the feeling of a woman reaching for the only ledge available. He listened to all of it, and he did not offer comfort in the way of someone trying to fix what cannot be fixed, but in the way of someone who understood that the point was not to fix it but to be present while it was being spoken. He told her more, in return, about a woman he had almost married in Texas, a kind woman whom he had stopped himself from marrying, because he had understood that he would be marrying her for the wrong reasons, for the not loneliness of it, rather than the love of it, and that he had left town partly because he could not stand the look on her face when he had told her the truth, and had spent a year wondering whether honesty had been its own kind of cruelty. He told her he had come to terms with it eventually, had understood that the honest refusal had been kinder than the dishonest acceptance, but that it had taught him to be careful about what he reached for and why. Eliza looked at him when he told her this, at the set of his jaw that told her this was not easy to say, and she thought about the particular kind of man who refused himself things rather than take them wrongly, who understood the difference between what he wanted and what was true, and she felt something that was not admiration exactly but was related to it, something deeper and less comfortable and more honest. He brought her things, sometimes, not gifts in the showy sense, but things he had found that reminded him of her. A small piece of rose quartz from the far pasture that was the color of the dress she had worn to church the previous Sunday. A feather from a red-tailed hawk that he said had been sitting on his fence post for 20 minutes that morning watching him work, which he said had struck him as the most educated-looking bird he had ever seen. She kept them on the windowsill of her room at the frontier house, and she was aware that she kept them on the windowsill where she could see them from her reading chair in the evenings, and she was aware of what that meant, and she did not look away from what it meant. He came to watch her teach, one Tuesday morning in October when the first real cold had come down from the north, and the children arrived bundled and bright-eyed. He sat at the back of the room in the chair that was too small for him, with his hat on his knee, and watched her go through the morning's lessons reading first, then arithmetic, then a geography lesson using the map. She was herself, entirely, in a way she had never been when she knew she was being observed in Boston, and she thought that was probably the truest measure of how far she had come from the woman who had lived in other people's plans. The children were not on their best behavior in the stiff, self-conscious way children sometimes performed for visitors. They were simply good and engaged in themselves, which was better. At the end of the morning, when the children had gone for their noon break and Eliza was erasing the blackboard, he said from the back of the room, "You're good at this." She turned and looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I am." He smiled at that, fully this time, the full smile she had not seen before, and it remade his face entirely in a way that made her grip the eraser rather tightly. Thomas, who had forgotten his lunch pail and come back for it, appeared in the doorway at that particular moment, took in the scene with the swift, comprehensive perception that had made him her best student, retrieved his lunch pail from under his desk, and departed with the dignity of a 12-year-old who understood precisely what he had just witnessed and was saying nothing about it. The conversation that had been building for 6 weeks arrived on a Saturday evening in early November, when the desert had taken on its autumn quality, the air sharp and clean, the light at an angle that turned the red rocks to amber, the sky at dusk going from blue to violet to a deep indigo that seemed to go on forever. They were at the cottonwood grove, sitting on the creek bank as they had in September, but the cottonwood leaves had gone gold now and a few of them came loose in the breeze and floated on the water. "I need to tell you something," Clyde said. She waited, with the stillness of someone who knows that what is coming is important and has been patient about it, and is willing to be patient for one more moment. He looked at the water. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "I have not been very good, historically, at saying the things I do mean, but I don't say things that aren't true." He paused. "I have been coming to town on Saturdays because you are here, and I have been thinking about you on the days between Saturdays. And I would very much like to keep doing both of those things, for a long time." She looked at him, at his profile in the amber light, at the careful way he was holding himself because he was a man who had learned to be careful with what he reached for. "Clyde," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like something she had been practicing without knowing it, something that fit. He turned to look at her. "I came to redemption because it was the only ledge I could reach," she said. I arrived here with nothing but a twisted ankle and a bandaged face and $4 in my pocket. And I have been building something here in this school and in this town, and it is mine, and I intend to keep it." She met his eyes. "I also intend to keep you, if you are willing to be kept." He looked at her with an expression that was so much more than a man had ever looked at her before that she felt it in her chest like a struck bell. "Eliza," he said, and then he did something she had not anticipated, which was to reach out and take her hand carefully, the way he did everything, not grasping, not performing, but genuinely taking and holding. His hand was warm and rough and steady around hers, and the creek went on making its sounds, and the cottonwood leaves went on releasing to the water. "Yes," he said, "I am willing to be kept." They sat there for a long time in the last of the light, their hands together, the words that had been building for 6 weeks having been said, and the space after them filling up with everything they would mean going forward. He kissed her for the first time when they walked back, at the edge of the cottonwood grove where the trees ended and the open scrubland began, and the full night sky was visible above them with its impossible width of stars. He stopped walking and she stopped with him, and he turned to her and looked at her face in the starlight with the same careful attention he gave everything, and then he kissed her with a quietness and a sureness that were entirely him, and she kissed him back with a certainty that surprised her and then didn't. Redemption, as small towns will, noticed. Tom Briggs at the general store noticed. Jim Reardon the blacksmith, who apparently made it his business to notice everything, noticed. Reverend Alcott noticed with a satisfaction he tried and mostly failed to conceal, and his wife Martha noticed with the decisive look of a woman who has been hoping for exactly this outcome and does not consider it any accident. There was talk of the mostly approving but sometimes less so kind that follows a single woman teacher in a small town being seen walking out with a rancher, and Eliza heard some of it and disregarded the approving portions as sentimental and the less approving portions as none of anyone's business. There was one man, a rancher named Delbert Suggs, who ran a large cattle operation north of town, and who had interests in the town council that he pursued with the cheerful aggression of someone who believed that being the most important man in the room was a God-given right, who said something at the general store one afternoon about outsiders bringing their Eastern attitudes that was clearly pointed in her direction. He said it to Clyde, which was a tactical error. Clyde looked at him for a long moment with a quality of patience that was not passive at all, the way a mountain is not passive, and then he said, "Eliza Blackwell is a fine teacher, and she is my business, and I would be careful, Delbert, with how you talk about things that are my business," in a voice so quiet, and even that it was considerably more effective than shouting would have been. Delbert Suggs subsided. He did not entirely reform, but he subsided, and his wife, who had been one of Eliza's most enthusiastic supporters from the beginning, took Eliza to lunch the following week and spent an hour being extensively complimentary about the improvements to the school in a way that was also clearly a domestic statement on the subject of her husband's behavior. The winter of 1882 came on in the desert with a crispness that was startling after the long heat, and Clyde moved his operations closer to town for the cold months, boarding his horses at the livery, while the heavy fence work waited for spring. He came to town more often, for supper at the hotel dining room with Eliza on Thursdays, for the Saturday walks that continued even in weather that made them brisk and brief, for the occasional evenings at the Alcott's house, where Martha Alcott had taken to hosting a small gathering on Friday nights that involved cards and conversation, and the kind of good-natured debate that a town with a preacher and a teacher and a blacksmith and a rancher could reliably produce. On one of those Friday evenings in December, the conversation had turned to the school, specifically to a proposal from Tom Briggs and a few of the other merchants to expand the school building before spring, add 2 rooms and proper bookshelves and a proper teacher's desk that was not, as Tom said with some embarrassment, a table that had started its life as a dining piece in someone's kitchen. Eliza had strong opinions about all of this, expressed them with the clarity that people had come to expect from her, and found herself locked in a cheerful argument with Clyde about the placement of the new bookshelves that she was entirely winning, when she noticed that Reverend Alcott and his wife were watching them with the particular expression of two people witnessing something that confirmed what they had already decided. She looked at Clyde. He looked at her. They were both talking about bookshelves, and both of them knew that the bookshelves were beside the point. He asked her to marry him on the first day of January, 1883. He did not do it with a production. He did not make it a spectacle. He came to Redemption on New Year's Day morning with the bay horse and a second horse, a gray mare that he had bought from Naya's husband 2 weeks before without telling anyone why, and he rode to the school where Eliza went on New Year's Day to plan the spring term, because she was the kind of person who planned the spring term on New Year's Day. He tied both horses at the rail outside and came in without knocking, which he never did, and she turned from the blackboard where she had been writing the names of the students in the careful grid she used for tracking their progress, and he was standing in the middle of the room with his hat in both hands and his jaw set in the way she had come to know meant he had something important to say, and was going to say it directly. "I need you to know something before I say what I'm going to say," he said. "All right," she said. "The ranch is small, the land is hard, the winters can be bad and the summers can be worse. I am a man who works long hours and comes home quiet, and I do not always know how to say the right thing, though I am working on it. And I want to be very clear that I am not asking you to give up the school or Redemption or anything you've built here. I intend to bring the ranch to you, not the other way around." She was very still. "Eliza," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him in the pale winter light coming through the school windows. This man who had come around a red rock outcropping on a bay horse and found her sitting in the road and treated the finding of her as the most natural next thing, who had given her coffee and wrapped her ankle and listened to her talk about her father, and who had, in the month since, shown her again and again that he was a person who did the right thing not because someone was watching, but because he had decided who he was and intended to live accordingly. "I want you to know something before I answer," she said. He waited. "I am not a woman who needs to be managed or handled or protected from difficult things. I am a woman who was thrown from a stagecoach 3 miles from anywhere and walked on a twisted ankle in dress boots before you found me, and I intend to keep being that woman." "I know," he said. "It's among the things I admire most about you, and I am going to keep teaching every day for as long as there are children in this town who need teaching." "I know that too," he said. "I wouldn't have it otherwise. The ranch is 3 miles from town. It's not the end of the earth." She looked at him for a moment more because she wanted to, because this was the face she was going to be looking at for the rest of her life, and she wanted to see it clearly. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Clyde Barnett." He crossed the room and she went to meet him, and when he put his arms around her, it was with the complete sureness of a man who had been careful about everything he reached for and knew exactly what he was holding now. The gray mare, he explained, was for her. He had bought her because Naya's husband had told him she was a steady, sure-footed horse for someone who was learning desert riding, and because he had thought that if the answer was yes, which he had hoped it would be but had not allowed himself to assume, the 3-mile ride to the ranch would be better on a horse she could trust. She named the mare Agnes, on the grounds that she looked like an Agnes, which made Clyde look at the horse with the expression of a man trying to see what an Agnes looked like, and then nod with the slow seriousness of someone conceding a point. Reverend Alcott married them on the 14th of February, 1883, because Martha Alcott had opinions about romance and the calendar, and because Clyde had said February was fine by him, and Eliza had said February was fine by her on condition that she didn't have to wait any longer than February, which had made him laugh with the full laugh she still treasured every time she heard it. The wedding was small, in the church with the fresh white paint, attended by the Alcotts and the Reardons and Tom Briggs and Victor and Naya and her family, and a collection of the town's residents who had decided, collectively, that this was the event of the early part of the year. Eliza wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had ordered from Tucson, with the fierce practicality of a woman who intended the dress to serve for many years beyond the wedding day. Her hair was pinned up with the ivory combs that had been her mother's, the one good thing she had taken when she left, and she carried a small bundle of dried wildflowers that Naya had brought that morning without explanation. She walked up the aisle to Clyde, who was standing at the front with his hat in his hand and his best shirt on, and the look on his face of a man who has just seen the thing he has been hoping for and can barely hold the fact of it. And she stood beside him, and they made their promises to each other in voices that were steady and clear and meant everything they said. And Reverend Alcott, who had been doing this for 30 years, said afterward to his wife that he had rarely seen a couple who appeared to be so genuinely listening to what they were promising as these two. The ranch, 3 miles east of Redemption, became Eliza's as completely as it was Clyde's, not because she subsumed herself into it, but because she expanded it with the force of her presence and her mind and her considerable capability. She continued to ride Agnes to school every morning and back every evening, and the rhythms of the school and the ranch interwove in the way of things that are compatible at the root. She put bookshelves in the ranch house that Clyde built with a precision that suggested he had been thinking about the specifications for a while, and she filled them with books that arrived on the stage from Tucson in irregular but satisfying deliveries. He taught her to shoot properly, which she already half knew from her father's insistence on the subject, and to track weather by the morning sky, and to read the land the way a rancher reads it, the subtle messages of soil and grass and the behavior of water. She taught him, not formally, not with any ceremony, but with the steady daily presence of a woman who loved language and precision, to write with a fluency that unlocked a capacity for correspondence and record-keeping that made the ranch's administration considerably more organized than it had been before. Victor, who was the ranch's only full-time hand, accepted Eliza with the same economy of manner with which he accepted most things, which was to say he assessed her, found her adequate, and subsequently modified that assessment upward several times until he arrived at a respect that he demonstrated not through words, but through small practical attentions, making sure Agnes was well fed on the mornings Eliza left early, keeping the water barrel near the house filled in summer, leaving fence repairs for weekends rather than Saturdays, so as not to leave her alone on the ranch during Clyde's town days. Spring brought the expansion of the school building, which happened in March when Tom Briggs organized the town into a building effort that lasted 2 weekends and produced 2 new rooms, proper bookshelves, and a teacher's desk of genuine dignity. Clyde spent both weekends working the construction with Jim Reardon and the other men, which Eliza found enormously and involuntarily touching, though she said nothing about it and expressed her appreciation in other ways. Thomas, in April, passed the examination that Eliza had arranged with Reverend Alcott for the secondary education certificate, the first student in the school's history to do so. His mother came to the school for the certificate presentation, and this time the warmth in Naya's face was not merely the consideration of warmth but the thing itself. She embraced Eliza briefly in a way that said everything that needed to be said, and Thomas stood with his certificate and looked at it with the contained, focused expression of someone who has been told the world has more rooms in it than he was first shown, and is already planning which ones to go into next. In the late summer of 1883, Eliza found herself sitting on the edge of the bed early one morning, before the light had fully come, and putting together the arithmetic of the last several weeks in the careful, systematic way her father had taught her to approach all questions of evidence and conclusion, and arriving at a certainty that she then sat with for a long, quiet moment before she heard Clyde in the kitchen starting the morning fire. She went to the kitchen, and he was at the stove with his back to her, and she stood in the doorway and said his name, and there was something in the way she said it that made him turn immediately, fully, with the complete attention he gave to things that mattered. She told him. The look on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. All the careful steadiness dissolved for a moment into something naked and bright, and he crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her face and looked at her with an expression that was not a word but was entirely legible. And then he said, "Are you all right?" Because he was who he was, and the first question was always about her. "More than all right," she said. "I am very well. We are very well." He held her in the kitchen with the fire beginning to warm the room and the desert beginning to take its morning color outside the window, and she put her cheek against his shoulder and felt the specific particular quality of rightness that this man's arms had carried for her since the very first time she had felt them. Behind her on the bay horse on the canyon road, steady and warm and exactly sufficient. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, in the way of a healthy woman who continued to work and ride and live with full engagement until the final month, which Clyde spent in a state of productive anxiety that expressed itself in repairs. He fixed every loose board, replaced the kitchen window latch, built a new cradle from ironwood and cedar that he sanded until it was smooth as silk, and reorganized the water supply system of the ranch in a comprehensive overhaul that Victor noted had been needed for some years. He also came to meet her at the school every evening in October and November rather than waiting for her to ride home, which she found unnecessary and entirely appreciated. Their son was born on the 21st of November, 1883, in the bedroom of the ranch house with Martha Alcott attending. She had 20 years of experience as a midwife in addition to her other considerable qualifications, and a doctor from Tucson who had come out on Clyde's urgent dispatch 2 days before the birth, and who spent most of his time acknowledging that Martha was doing everything correctly. Eliza held the boy in the first morning after, the thin winter light coming through the bedroom window and the ranch quiet except for the sound of horses in the yard. And she looked at this new face, her son, round and red and emphatic in his presence, with dark eyes that were going to be his father's eyes and a jaw that was going to be his mother's jaw. And she felt the world expand in a way she had not known it could still expand. Clyde came in from the yard where he had been since the birth, unable to stay still but unable to go far, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy and looked at Eliza with the full unguarded expression that she had first seen in the kitchen when she told him, and she had the thought clear and warm and entirely settled, that this was what she had been building toward without knowing she was building, that every chapter of her life, even the ones that had been hardest, had been pointing her in the direction of this room, this man, this child, this morning. They named him Amos, for her father, and the second name was James, for Clyde's father, and the full name Amos James Barnett satisfied both of them with the deep, settled satisfaction of a thing that has been made right. Victor brought a carved wooden horse to the house 2 days after the birth, set it on the porch rail without knocking, and was found by Clyde on his way back from the water tank looking at it with an expression of careful craftsman's pride that he quickly reassembled into his usual neutral. Clyde thanked him. Victor nodded twice and went back to the fence line. Naya brought food for a week, a different dish each day, rich and warmly seasoned, each accompanied by Thomas, who carried it to the door with the dignity of an appointed envoy, and who spent the handover moments looking at baby Amos with the barely contained scientific interest of an extremely intelligent 12-year-old considering a new kind of problem. Eliza returned to school in January, arranging her schedule with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had decided that identity was not something to be abandoned at the first demand of other identities. She organized the days so that Amos came to school with her for the first months, in a basket near her desk, observed by 23 students with the varying degrees of fascination that infant humans inspire in children, and growing up to the sounds of reading and arithmetic and geography, and the scratch of chalk on blackboard, which seemed, based on his temperament to suit him entirely. Delbert Suggs made one more attempt in the spring of 1884 to pressure the town council into replacing Eliza on the grounds that a married woman with a child had no business in a classroom. He brought it as a formal proposal, which required a formal response. Eliza sat before the town council, 5 men, 3 of whom she had taught at least one of their children to read, and 2 of whom she had beaten at cards at Martha Alcott's Friday evenings. And she spoke for 20 minutes with the clarity and precision of a woman who had spent 2 years teaching children to think carefully about evidence and argument. And she presented the academic outcomes of every student under her instruction, the expansion of the school, the correspondence she had opened with the Territorial Education Office about further improvements, and the fact that she had, in 2 years, turned a school that had lost a teacher to a dispute with a saloon into one of the better functioning educational establishments in the territory. The vote was 4-1 in her favor, with only Delbert Suggs dissenting, and when she left the council meeting, Clyde was waiting outside with Agnes saddled, and the look on his face of a man who had not doubted the outcome but had been prepared to be very clear about his own views if it had gone otherwise. 4-1, she said. I heard, he said. He helped her onto Agnes, and his hand lingered a moment on hers. I was never worried. You were a little worried, she said. He smiled. I was a little worried. They rode home together in the spring evening, through the desert that was doing its brief, explosive, annual miracle of wildflowers. The poppies and lupin and desert marigold coming up from the hard ground in colors that seemed impossible for this landscape until they happened, and then seemed entirely inevitable. Amos was at home with Victor, who had recently, and without announcement, expanded his job description to include child supervision in the specific hours when it was needed, performed with the same calm competence he brought to everything. The years settled into their shape, the particular shape of a life that is not without difficulty but is good at the root, built on solid ground. The ranch grew slowly, the way honest things grow, from 40 head to 60 to 80. The water supply improved in the way that Clyde's patient, systematic attention to the land eventually achieved improvement. The horses a consistent quality that built his reputation as someone worth buying from. Eliza's school expanded again in 1885, adding a 3rd room and a small library that she had fundraised for through a combination of personal correspondence with book suppliers in the East and a letter to the territorial governor that produced a modest but real appropriation. Thomas went to study in Tucson in 1886, sponsored by a fund that Eliza had helped establish with money from the Territorial Education Office and several donations from Redemption's better-disposed citizens. He came back to visit in 1887 with the particular quality of a young man who has been given more room and found that he was large enough to fill it. And he sat at the school desk, where he had once puzzled through books that were too easy for him, and told Eliza about what he was learning. And she listened with the satisfaction of a gardener standing in front of something they planted in difficult soil. In 1887, Eliza discovered she was expecting their 2nd child, and this time she sat in the kitchen and told Clyde over morning coffee, and his response was the same as it had always been: hands on her face, the naked, bright expression. Are you all right? And then they sat at the kitchen table in the morning light and talked about it in the easy, full way of 2 people who have built the kind of understanding that makes even the unexpected feel like something navigable. Their daughter was born in April of 1888, loud and immediate, and with an expression of determined assessment that made the Tucson doctor who had returned for the occasion look mildly alarmed. They named her Clara Rose Clara for Martha Alcott's mother, about whom Martha told stories that made Clara seem like the kind of woman whose name deserved perpetuation, and Rose for the quartz stone that was still on the windowsill of the ranch house bedroom, the one Clyde had brought from the far pasture in the early days, the color of the dress she had worn to church. Amos, 4.5 years old, received the arrival of Clara Rose with the measured seriousness of a child, who has clearly been thinking about this for some time. He brought her a small drawing he had done, a horse, clearly identifiable as such, which was his current primary artistic subject, and placed it in the cradle beside her with the ceremony of a diplomat presenting credentials, which made Clyde go very still in the way he sometimes did when something was almost more than he could hold, and which made Eliza take his hand without looking at him because she knew. The summer of 1888 was full in the way of a life in full production. The ranch and the school, and the two children, and the town, all of it moving in the particular orchestrated complexity of everything being real and alive, and demanding and worth every demand. There were difficulties. There were always difficulties in this country. The drought in the late part of the year that required careful management of the water supply, the fence disputes that were endemic to ranching in the territory, the occasional sick cattle, the student who required more patience than all the others combined, the town council meeting about the proposed railroad spur that divided the town neatly in half and produced 6 months of heated discussion before the spur went through anyway. There were evenings when Clyde came in from the range silent and tired, and she let him be silent and tired for a while before supper, and evenings when she came home from school, frustrated with something that could not be fixed, and he sat with her while she talked it through. There were the ordinary frictions of two strong-willed people sharing a life, and the ordinary resolutions of two people who had agreed to be honest with each other and held to that agreement. There was also the other thing, the enduring thing, the thing that had been there from the first moment he had reached around her for the reins on the canyon road. It was not the dramatic, consuming thing of the early months. It was something more substantial than that, more capable of bearing weight. It was the way he still reached for her hand in the evenings without thinking about it, the way she still laughed at the things he said that were meant to be funny, and the things he said that were not meant to be funny but were. It was the look he still gave her sometimes across rooms full of people, the specific look that said, "I chose you entirely on purpose, and I would choose you again right now," and her returning it with the warmth that she now understood had been building in her since the moment she had looked up from the Arizona dust and found him coming around an outcropping at exactly the right moment. On a September evening in 1888, 6 years after a stagecoach wheel had shattered on the lip of a canyon road, Eliza sat on the porch of the ranch house with Clara Rose asleep in her lap, and Amos occupied at the table inside with the wooden blocks that were currently his primary engineering project. And Clyde came and sat beside her on the porch bench and put his arm around her in the particular way that was entirely familiar and entirely not tiresome. And they looked at the desert together in the last light of the day. The desert was the color of hammered copper. The sky above the western buttes was layered in every shade between gold and deep purple, the kind of sky this country produced with the lavishness of something that does not know how to do things halfway. Somewhere out in the scrubland, something was moving, a coyote, probably, or a javelina, the kind of life that did not stop for human observation but simply continued being itself in the enormous unhurried space. "I have been thinking," Eliza said. "About what?" he said. "About the particular chain of circumstances that resulted in my being here," she said. "A bad stagecoach wheel, a loose stone on a shelf road, a man I had never met, and you were coming from the direction of redemption." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the copper desert. "I had actually been to town twice that week," he said. "Usually I only go once. I went back the second time because I had forgotten a part for the water pump at Tom Briggs's store." He paused. "If I had remembered it the first time, I would have been back at the ranch by the time you were on that road." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the sky. "I have thought about that," he said, "more than once." She looked at the sky too, at the copper and gold and the first stars beginning to come through in the deep east, and she thought about chains of circumstances, and the nature of luck, and the question of whether things happen for reasons or whether meaning is something you make rather than find. She thought about her father saying a thing once, late in his life, that she had not fully understood at the time, that the most important choices in a life were usually not the ones you recognized as choices when you made them. A forgotten water pump part, a stagecoach wheel with a fracture no one had noticed. A woman who sat up straight in the road and took inventory of her situation rather than giving in to despair. "I am glad you forgot it," she said. He turned to look at her, and in the last light of the evening his face held everything she had learned about him in 6 years, the steadiness and the care, and the particular warmth that was not performed and never had been, and she thought she had not in those 6 years ever stopped finding it the most interesting face in her world. "So am I," he said. "Every day." Clara rose, stirred in her lap, made the small definitive sound of a baby who is about to make a larger opinion about her situation, and Eliza shifted her and she settled. And Amos called from inside the house about a block structure that had become architecturally ambitious beyond his current skill set and needed his father's consultation, and Clyde called back that he would be in momentarily. And the evening continued in the way of evenings in a house full of life, noisier and better, and more exhausting, and more sustaining than any single version of a future that either of them might have imagined standing alone at the beginning of their roads. Later, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, they sat by the kitchen stove with coffee the way they often did, and she got out the letter she had been composing to the Territorial Education Office about funding for a secondary school in Redemption, because Thomas was not going to be the last child from this town who needed a farther horizon, and she spread her papers on the table, and Clyde got out the ledger for the ranch because fall was the settling accounts time of year, and they worked in the shared, companionable silence of people who have made a home together in the deepest sense of that word, where home is not a place but a practice, something you choose and build, and keep choosing every day. The lamp between them threw a warm circle of light over both of them, and outside the ranch house the desert lay under its enormous sky, 3 miles east of Redemption, as vast and honest and enduring as it had always been, as full of the particular life that it had always contained. The coyote and the hawk, the wildflower and the red stone, the night air that smelled of sage and distance, and the clean, permanent fact of the earth itself. Eliza Blackwell Barnett looked up from her papers at the man across the table and thought, for the 1000th and not the last time, that the best thing that had ever been thrown was her, from that stagecoach, onto that road, 3 miles from anywhere where he was. Clyde Barnett looked up from his ledger and found her watching him and held her gaze with the full, unhurried certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was and exactly why. "All right," he said. "Better than all right," she said. And she was. And she would be. And the desert went on turning under its stars, old and indifferent and magnificent, holding the small, warm light of their window the way it held everything, without favor, without malice, in the enormous democratic silence of a country that asked only whether you were willing to meet it honestly and be shaped by what was true, and gave back to those who were, something that lasted.